Story 1. The house on Elm Street. Eric had been working as a food delivery driver for nearly 2 years, and while he'd had his fair share of strange encounters, nothing could have prepared him for the nightmare that awaited him on a rainy Friday night. The order came in around 9:30 p.m. late-night delivery to a house on Elm Street. It was in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, known for its older, slightly run-down homes. The rain was coming down in sheets as Eric drove through the nearly deserted streets. The GPS led him to a dilapidated house at the end of a cul-de-sac, its windows dark, the porch light flickering ominously. He hesitated for a moment, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread as he stared at the house. But with a shrug, he grabbed the food and headed to the door. He knocked once, then twice, but there was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, and finally, the door creaked open on its own. The inside of the house was pitch black, and a musty smell wafted out, making Eric gag. He called out, but no one responded. Thinking the customer might be hard of hearing or in another room, he stepped inside, placing the food on a small table near the door. As he turned to leave, he heard a faint noise coming from deeper within the house. It sounded like someone whispering his name. Eric froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He strained to hear, and the whisper came again. Clearer this time, Eric. Fear gripped him as he realized that no one had seen him enter the house. His phone had no signal, and the door, which had swung shut behind him, wouldn't budge when he tried to open it. Panic set in as he banged on the door, yelling for help, but his cries were swallowed by the darkness around him. Suddenly, a light flickered on at the end of a long hallway, revealing a shadowy figure standing motionless. Eric's breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly began to move towards him, its footsteps echoing eerily in the otherwise silent house. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his head with a chorus of voices calling his name. Desperate, Eric turned and ran, stumbling through the darkened rooms, searching for another way out. But every door he tried was locked, and the windows were barred. The whispers followed him, the figure always just out of sight, but getting closer with every second. Finally, he burst into a small room at the back of the house. There, in the center, was a single chair facing a large, cracked mirror. The whispers stopped abruptly as he stepped inside, and for a brief moment, there was silence. Then slowly, the chair began to turn on its own, revealing that it was empty. Eric's reflection in the mirror began to distort, his face twisting into a grotesque version of himself, his mouth opening in a silent scream. He tried to look away, but the mirror held him captive, his eyes locked on the horror before him. The figure appeared behind him in the reflection, its face hidden in shadow. As it reached out, Eric felt a cold hand on his shoulder, and the last thing he heard was his own name whispered in his ear before everything went black. When the police arrived the next morning, responding to a missing persons report, they found Eric's car abandoned outside the house. Inside, the only sign that anyone had been there was the food delivery bag left on the table near the door. Eric was never found, and the house on Elm Street was eventually condemned, its dark secrets sealed within its crumbling walls. Story 2. The silent customer. It was just past midnight when Maria received an order for a delivery to a small apartment complex on the edge of town. The place was known for being a bit sketchy, with a few too many stories of strange happenings, but Maria had been working the night shift for a while and had grown used to it. She grabbed the bag of food, punched the address into her GPS, and set off. When she arrived, the complex was eerily quiet, the dim streetlights casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. The apartment she was delivering to was on the 3rd floor, and as she climbed the stairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The hallway was dark, with only a single flickering light at the far end. She found the apartment number 37 and knocked on the door. There was no response. She knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. Finally, she pulled out her phone and called the number associated with the order. It rang several times before going to voicemail. Frustrated, Maria was about to leave when she heard a faint shuffling noise coming from inside the apartment. Reluctantly, she knocked one last time, and to her surprise, the door creaked open slightly. She could just make out the silhouette of someone standing in the shadows. "Hello?" she called out. "Your food is here." The figure didn't move or respond, just stood there, silent and still. Maria's skin prickled with unease. She cleared her throat and tried again, but the figure remained motionless. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, and Maria's instinct screamed at her to leave. She placed the bag on the floor in front of the door and quickly turned to walk away. But as she did, she heard the door creak opened wider, and then a soft, raspy voice spoke. She froze, her heart pounding. The voice was barely above a whisper, and there was something unsettlingly off about it. Maria turned back, her eyes straining to see into the darkness of the apartment. The figure stepped forward, just enough for her to see their outline, but their face was still obscured by shadow. "Come in," the voice said, even softer now, almost pleading. Maria shook her head. "I can't. I'm just the delivery driver." "Please," the voice insisted, sounding more desperate. Just for a moment, every instinct screamed at Maria to get out of there, but something about the way the figure spoke made it impossible for her to move. Against her better judgment, she found herself taking a hesitant step forward, crossing the threshold into the apartment. The door swung shut behind her, plunging the room into near-total darkness. Maria could barely make out the figure standing just a few feet away, but something about them had changed. The air grew heavy, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. "Where are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, she heard that same raspy voice, but now it was right behind her, whispering into her ear, "I've been waiting for you." Maria spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the oppressive darkness that seemed to press in on her from all sides. Panic set in and she reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. Suddenly, the lights flickered on, revealing the apartment in all its nightmarish horror. The walls were covered in what looked like blood, smeared in disturbing patterns. The furniture was overturned, broken as if a struggle had taken place. But the most horrifying sight was the figure standing in the corner, now fully visible. It was a man, or at least what was left of him. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes sunken and lifeless. His mouth hung open, and from it came that same raspy whisper, "I've been waiting." Maria screamed, her voice echoing off the walls, but no one came to her aid. The man stepped closer, his bony fingers reaching out for her. She backed away, her mind racing for a way out, but the apartment was a maze of horror, every exit blocked or locked. In a final act of desperation, Maria lunged for a window and shattered the glass with her elbow. She climbed out onto the fire escape, her arms and legs shaking uncontrollably. As she scrambled down the metal stairs, she heard the man's voice again, now coming from every direction, whispering her name over and over. She never looked back, running as fast as she could to her car. When she finally reached it, she sped away, not stopping until she was miles from the apartment complex. Maria quit her job that night and vowed never to return to that part of town again. But even now, in her darkest moments, she can still hear that voice whispering her name, reminding her that some deliveries should never be made. Story 3. The late night request. Jake had always prided himself on being reliable. No matter how late the hour or how dangerous the area, he always delivered the food on time. It was how he earned the highest tips and maintained a loyal customer base. But one night, he received a request that would make him rethink his commitment to the job. It was nearly 1 when the order came in, small pizza, some wings, and a 2-liter of soda. The address was on the outskirts of town, far from any main roads, down a series of winding, unpaved paths. Jake hesitated for a moment, but decided to take the order. The payout was too good to pass up. The drive was long, and the further he went, the more isolated it became. Trees loomed on either side of the narrow road, their branches casting eerie shadows in his headlights. Finally, he arrived at the location, a small, rundown cabin that looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in years. There were no lights on, no sign of life. Jake checked the address again, sure that he must have made a mistake, but the GPS confirmed it. He got out of the car, the cold night air biting at his skin, and approached the cabin. As he got closer, he noticed the door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the wind. "Hello?" he called out, hoping to hear someone inside, but there was no response. He knocked on the door, and it swung open further, revealing the dark interior of the cabin. Jake's nerves began to fray as he stepped inside, the old wooden floorboards creaking under his weight. The cabin was sparse, with only a few pieces of broken furniture and a thick layer of dust covering everything. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic. Jake wrinkled his nose trying to place the scent, and that's when he saw it. In the center of the room was a large stain on the floor, dark and crusted, leading to a trapdoor that was slightly ajar. A sense of dread washed over him as he realized what the smell was. Jake's instinct screamed at him to leave, but something compelled him to move closer to the trapdoor. He didn't want to look, but his curiosity got the better of him. With a shaky hand, he pushed the door open, peering into the darkness below. At first, he saw nothing, just an empty void. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw the outline of something or someone moving. Before he could react, the figure lunged at him, grabbing his leg and pulling him down into the dark. Jake struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the grip was too strong. He was dragged into the cellar, the door slamming shut above him, plunging him into complete darkness. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the sound of heavy breathing filled his ears. He could barely see, but he could feel the presence of others in the darkness, their cold hands brushing against his skin. Panic set in as he realized he was not alone. The sound of chains rattling echoed through the small space, and Jake's heart raced as he felt something cold and sharp pressed against his throat. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but his body was paralyzed with fear. The figure holding him leaned in close, whispering something he couldn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the pressure released and the figure vanished into the darkness. Jake lay there, too terrified to move, listening to the sounds of the cellar. The breathing, the rattling chains, the faint whispers, they all seemed to close in on him. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes, he couldn't tell. Finally, the trapdoor creaked open and a dim light flooded the cellar. Jake scrambled up the stairs, his legs barely carrying him as he bolted out of the cabin. He didn't stop running until he was back in his car, slamming the door shut and speeding away. The memory of the cellar, the figures in the dark, haunted him for days afterward. He never reported the incident, too shaken by what had happened to even consider going to the authorities. He left his job as a delivery driver and never returned to that part of town again. But every night, when he closes his eyes, he's back in that cabin, the smell of blood and decay filling his nostrils, the whispers in the dark calling his name.